In his book on Nietzsche, Walter Kaufmann describes what he calls the Nietzsche legend. Most people with only a cursory awareness of Nietzsche probably believe a number of myths about him, so-called facts about his life that are in actuality exaggerations, rumors, or outright falsehoods. I would even go so far as to say that in most of the introductions to Nietzsche that I have encountered, there are usually 2 or 3 such myths. One of the most common of these is that Nietzsche's collapse into dementia was brought about by syphilis. Since Nietzsche is also known for being unsuccessful with women, usually this claim is paired with the allegation that he must have contracted it from visiting a brothel. This myth has been repeated uncritically ad nauseum so many times that it's become one of those claims that people don't even feel the need to justify with evidence, presented with the usual prefix, "some people say." Now, it should be said that there is a reason why people make this claim. It's not as if there is zero evidence for it. But let's examine that evidence. Nietzsche was diagnosed with syphilis when he was committed to the hospital at Jena. The problem with using this diagnosis as evidence, however, is that later research has shown that such a diagnosis was impossible. There are a number of facts that show this. Nietzsche suffered from migraine headaches throughout his entire life, as well as stomach aches, dizziness, and near blindness. Eventually, he reported to his friends that he could see visual phosphenes. The worsening of his condition led to Nietzsche's early retirement from the University of Basel. Nietzsche pursued a number of cures over the years, with occasional but limited success in making life more tolerable for himself. In his final productive year of 1888, he began to show signs of insanity, talking to himself late at night in his room, shredding his money and throwing it in the waste bin, dancing naked in his apartment. On January 3, 1889, Nietzsche was confronted by 2 policemen at Piazza Carlo Alberto in Turin after making a public disturbance. He then collapsed and in the following days was uncommunicative except to utter nonsensical phrases. Nietzsche would never again regain lucidity. Nietzsche's landlord, Davide Fino, persuaded the police to release Nietzsche into his custody. Then, Nietzsche's friend, the theologian Franz Overbeck, traveled to Turin and conveyed Nietzsche to a psychiatric hospital at Basel. After a short stint there, Nietzsche was moved to a clinic in Jena, where he could be closer to his mother. After some years, Nietzsche became catatonic. He would spend the final years of his life under the direct care of his sister until he died of pneumonia in the year 1900. The initial diagnosis of the doctors who treated Nietzsche was paretic syphilis. In the Journal of Medical Biography, Volume 11, February 2003, Leonard Sachs lists off the reasons why this diagnosis was in error. First of all, Nietzsche's longevity. Sachs writes, quote, "In the pre-antibiotic era, it was unusual for patients with paretic syphilis to survive longer than 2 years after the onset of symptoms. In Kraepelin's series of 244 patients with paretic syphilis, 229 out of 244 had died within 5 years, and 242 out of the 244 had died within 9 years. One patient out of the 244 lingered for 14 years. Nietzsche, however, still appeared to most observers to be in good health for many years after his collapse. One visitor in the summer of 1899, 10 years after Nietzsche's collapse, believed that he could still be cured." End quote. If Nietzsche indeed had syphilis and survived for 11 years after his collapse, that would put him in a minuscule percentile of patients, around 0.5% of syphilis patients at that time. This isn't impossible, but it should raise some eyebrows as to how plausible the syphilis diagnosis really is. Even if he contracted it in the year immediately before his collapse, in 1888, he would be in the company of the most extraordinarily long-lived of syphilitic patients. Let's look at Nietzsche's symptoms. The sudden onset of grandiose or unrealistic ideas is one of the common symptoms of advanced syphilis. There is no shortage of commenters who are willing to suggest that Nietzsche's philosophical career would prove such a diagnosis, given, for example, the bombastic and megalomaniacal writings of 1888. At a cursory glance, this may seem like plausible evidence. But in all honesty, it is difficult to say that the Nietzsche who wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra is significantly less grandiose or megalomaniacal in his vision than the Nietzsche who wrote Ecce Homo. The self-aggrandizing statements of Ecce Homo may seem like evidence of syphilis if we have nothing to compare it to, but given that Nietzsche had written books attempting to found new religions, it's much harder to make that case. Perhaps more importantly, Sachs writes, quote, "When Arthur Muthman, a psychiatrist at the Basel Asylum, analyzed Nietzsche's journal after his death. He found it to be completely unlike anything that he had ever seen written by a patient with paretic syphilis. Muthman concluded that the notebooks alone were sufficient evidence to reject the diagnosis of paretic syphilis. End quote. All of this may shed further doubt on the syphilis diagnosis, but one could argue that we have at least not refuted it, and fair enough. But there's more. Sachs writes, quote, Nietzsche could stick out his tongue without the tremor, which was practically the sine qua non of paretic syphilis. End quote. To put this in layman's terms, without tremor in the tongue, it's certain that you do not have paretic syphilis. Nietzsche did not show the symptom even at the end of his life. This would seem to almost refute the syphilis claim on its own, but there's more. We have not explained the other symptoms: headaches, dizziness, visual phosphenes. Again, symptoms such as headaches would seem at a cursory glance to fit with syphilis, but there is a serious problem with that supposition. Quote, Nietzsche was only 9 years old when he began missing school owing to migraine. Throughout his adolescence, the severe migraines caused him to be absent from school for periods of a week or longer. Because severe headache can be a harbinger of paretic syphilis, Nietzsche's headaches may seem to support the hypothesis that his dementia was caused by syphilis. However, the headache occasioned by syphilitic infection of the central nervous system precedes the general collapse, sometimes for only a few days or a week, often for several weeks, rarely for 2 or 3 months, according to an experienced neurologist writing when paretic syphilis was still common. If one attributes Nietzsche's headaches to paretic syphilis, then one must be willing to assert a span of 35 years between the onset of headaches, age 9, and the general collapse, age 44. End quote. Aside from the absurdity of a 9-year-old Nietzsche contracting syphilis at a brothel, the headaches clearly cannot be construed as a symptom of syphilis, as Nietzsche suffered from attacks of migraines on and off for years instead of months, and a 35-year infection period would be unheard of. Therefore, all of the major symptoms that would superficially seem to point to syphilis, headaches, grandiose ideas, rapid decline into insanity, don't actually fit with the diagnosis at all. The headaches began at age 9, and the grandiose ideas aren't the same as those of a syphilitic, judging from Muthman's study of Nietzsche's notebooks. Nietzsche's improbable longevity and lack of tremor in the tongue would therefore seem to settle the matter. Nothing about the syphilis diagnosis really makes any sense. So what evidence does remain? Really, the only evidence we have is that a doctor made the diagnosis. But a diagnosis on its own isn't evidence. The diagnosis isn't a symptom, it's an interpretation of the symptoms. The diagnosis is only evidence that a doctor thought Nietzsche had syphilis. If that diagnosis is contradicted by all of the facts at hand, then our conclusion must be that the diagnosis was wrong. Such a claim would of course come with the burden of providing an alternative explanation. But the short answer is that we don't know. We have a couple of decent hypotheses that make far more sense than syphilis, but we obviously don't have a living patient to examine or an intact body to autopsy, so determining Nietzsche's condition can only ever be speculation. Nonetheless, Sachs advances the possibility that Nietzsche's condition was a tumor behind his right eye. The best evidence for this hypothesis is that Nietzsche's headaches were predominantly on the right side of the head. Quote, the right-sided predilection of Nietzsche's headaches, a fact which is completely unaccounted for by the hypothesis of paretic syphilis, would be expected in a patient with a meningioma of the right optic nerve, underlying the right frontal lobe of the brain. If a meningioma of the right optic nerve were present in this case, a gradual increase in the size of the mass would have led effectively to a de facto frontal lobotomy. Such an effect would account for the further deterioration of Nietzsche's mental state between 1889 and 1900. End quote. Again, to put this simply, syphilitics have headaches that flare up on both sides of the head. The fact that Nietzsche's were only on his right side points to some other condition. The term that Sachs uses here, meningioma, is defined on WebMD. Quote, a tumor that forms on membranes that cover the brain and spinal cord just inside the skull. Specifically, the tumor forms on the 3 layers of membranes that are called meninges. These tumors are often slow-growing. End quote. A tumor would also explain the visual phosphenes, which had never been reported in syphilitics but should be expected in cases of meningioma. As far back as 1884, Nietzsche reported these symptoms to his friend Risse Schornhofe. Nietzsche told her that when he closed his eyes, quote, he saw a profusion of fantastic flowers, twining round each other and constantly growing, changing in shape and color with exotic opulence. With disturbing urgency in his soft voice, he asked, "Don't you think this is a symptom of incipient madness?" End quote. Leonard Sachs admits that he cannot, of course, be certain about his tumor hypothesis because, quote, the available data do not suffice to make a diagnosis with certainty, end quote. Beyond Sachs's work, there is another possibility other than a tumor which would account for these symptoms and also help to explain a medical mystery from Nietzsche's early life. In 1849, Nietzsche's father, Carl Ludwig Nietzsche, died from what the attending physician described as liquefaction of the brain. Obviously, we have even less information about Carl Ludwig Nietzsche's illness than we do about Friedrich Nietzsche's, but we know the following. Carl Ludwig fell ill relatively quickly. In a short period of time, he went blind and then insane. After bouts of painful cramping that would have been excruciating, he died at the age of 36. Less than a year later, Nietzsche's younger brother, the 2-year-old Joseph Nietzsche, suffered from severe cramps, then also died. The conventional wisdom has been that Carl Ludwig must have suffered a stroke, but given what happened to Nietzsche and his younger brother, there is a possibility that his illness was congenital. Is there a congenital illness that could explain all three of these cases? Yes, it's known as cerebral autosomal dominant arteriopathy with subcortical infarcts and leukoencephalopathy, CADASIL. This disorder can cause multiple strokes in the patient and almost certainly results in premature death. According to the U.S. National Library of Medicine, quote, in individuals with CADASIL, a stroke can occur at any time from childhood to late adulthood, but typically happens during mid-adulthood. People with CADASIL often have more than one stroke in their lifetime. Recurrent strokes can damage the brain over time. Strokes that occur in the subcortical region of the brain, which is involved in reasoning and memory, can cause progressive loss of intellectual function, dementia, and changes in mood and personality. The age at which the signs and symptoms of CADASIL first begin varies greatly among affected individuals, as does the severity of these features. End quote. The disease adversely affects blood vessels, eventually destroying the vascular muscle cells surrounding them. Nietzsche's migraines could potentially be explained as the result of the blood vessel damage, arteriopathy, which is known to cause migraines, often accompanied by visual sensations, or auras. Accordingly, a team of Dutch researchers advanced the CADASIL hypothesis in 2013, in light of the details of Nietzsche's symptoms and his family history. From the abstract of their study, quote, during his last years, a progressive cognitive decline evolved and ended in a profound dementia with stroke. The family history includes a possible vascular-related mental illness in his father, who died from stroke at 36. Cerebral autosomal dominant arteriopathy with subcortical infarcts and leukoencephalopathy, CADASIL, accounts for all the signs and symptoms of Nietzsche's illness. This study adds new elements to the debate and controversy about Nietzsche's illness. End quote. So, while we will never know for certain what Nietzsche's condition truly was, if we set aside all pre-existing biases and consider the facts at hand, then what we have is the case of a patient who suffered from painful migraines from the age of 9 onward, with a family history of similar symptoms in both his father and younger brother. He eventually went mostly blind, the same fate as his father. The visual phosphenes, dizziness, and stomach cramping must also be taken into account. Though Nietzsche lasted much longer than his father, there could be considerable variability in longevity in the case of a CADASIL diagnosis. His collapse in Turin could be attributed in that explanation to yet another blood clot that finally deprived him once and for all of his lucidity. Sachs's theory that the culprit was a tumor is also plausible. That wouldn't explain Nietzsche's stomach pains, but it's also possible that his stomach pains were an unrelated illness from his headaches. We simply don't know. It's interesting to speculate and debate about whether the cancer hypothesis or the CADASIL hypothesis is the better explanation. But at least such a discussion would be based on the available facts. Hopefully, we could all undertake that discussion with the intellectual humility to understand that none of us really have the answer, and we're trying to diagnose someone who is long dead. But what I have noticed is that the people who toss out the syphilis hypothesis are always totally lacking in this kind of intellectual humility. People will repeat this claim as if it's a certainty, when in fact there is a wealth of evidence in opposition to this idea and a fair bit of evidence that outright refutes it. The real reason why this claim persists has nothing to do with a debate about the facts. It's a part of the Nietzsche legend. It's an especially appealing part of the legend for those who dislike Nietzsche. There will likely be people in this very comments section who will reassert the syphilis claim with zero evidence because their motivation is to denigrate Nietzsche. They're simply not interested in the facts. I'm not saying that we can't discuss the possibility that Nietzsche had syphilis or that we should close all discussion around that possibility. But let's be honest. When it comes to this myth, there's not a discussion. It's just people repeating a claim for which there's no evidence over and over again as part of a character attack. There are many good reasons to criticize or reject Nietzsche. I've certainly made some of those criticisms myself. But the syphilis claim, for all intents and purposes, is complete bullshit. It's time to call it that. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.